Mikhail Gorbachev is remembered in history as the first and only president of the Soviet Union. In 2008, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from former U.S. President George H.W. Bush for his major role in ending the Cold War. And just before the USSR collapsed, in 1990, Gorbachev was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Time magazine even named him one of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century. But let's look at what was actually happening inside the country. During his leadership, the standard of living in the Soviet Union, a superpower that had once been the first to send a man into space, was roughly the same as in Mexico or Chile. In the leading Western countries, it was 2 or even 3 times higher. By the late 1980s, entire pieces of the former superpower, which once covered 1/6 of the Earth's land, started breaking away. For ordinary people, this meant empty store shelves and a total shortage of everything they needed. So how did a country that made an incredible industrial leap in the 1930s weaken so quickly and eventually fall apart? In this piece, we'll take a close look at why the dream of a bright communist future collapsed in just 70 years, and what serious mistakes the Soviet leadership made along the way. Ready for an interesting journey through the history of this unique economic experiment? The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics appeared on the world map in 1922. The new country rose from the ruins of the Russian Empire, a mostly agricultural nation where, by the time of the 1917 revolution, about 80% of the population were peasants living in villages. The Bolsheviks were pushing ideas of proletarian revolution in a country where the working class, the proletariat, was only just beginning to form. At the same time, Europe could already feel a new major conflict coming. After the Treaty of Versailles, French Marshal Ferdinand Foch put it perfectly: this is not peace. It is only an armistice for 20 years. Soviet leaders understood clearly, an agricultural country would not survive the coming war. To catch up with the West and build a strong, independent economy, the Bolsheviks launched massive industrialization of this peasant nation. Stalin said it straight: we are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must cover this distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or we will be crushed. But how do you turn millions of peasants into workers? There were almost no factories, and most people couldn't read or write. According to the 1920 census, only 1/3 of the population could read and write. So the first big campaign was to wipe out illiteracy. Yesterday's peasant had to learn how to operate a machine during the day and read party newspapers in the evening. At the same time, the whole country began carrying out the Goelro plan. Electricity reached cities and villages, electrified railroads were built, and inefficient steam engines became a thing of the past. The main goal of Goelro wasn't just Lenin's light bulb in every home, it was to provide cheap energy for new factories. It was during those years that giants like the Magnitogorsk Iron and Steel Works, the Ural Heavy Machine Building Plant, and the Gorky Automobile Plant were built. Many of these companies still form the backbone of Russian industry today. To power them, huge power plants were constructed across the country. At the end of the 1920s, they started building the largest hydroelectric station in Europe on the Dnieper River. These were the heroic years of the first 5-year plan, which people still remember with pride. As a result, by the early 1930s, about 13 million people had moved from villages to cities, roughly 8% of the country's population. The population was growing, but there were fewer hands left in the countryside. They needed to sharply increase productivity in farming to feed the whole country. This is when the Soviet leadership launched collectivization, a decision later called one of its biggest mistakes. If the leaders back then had understood economics better, many of the crises in the 1990s might have been avoided. But let's go back to the early steps of the Soviet economy. Look at the posters from that time about collectivization. On most of them, the main hero is a tractor, the symbol of uniting peasant lands. By the late 1920s, it became clear, to supply factories with raw materials and cities with food, they had to dramatically improve agriculture. The simplest way was to replace manual labor with machines. But machines need big fields. So in 1928, forced collectivization began across the country. Small peasant plots were merged into large collective farms. Why is this considered a fatal mistake? During the process, prosperous peasants, called kulaks, were repressed. They were shot or sent to labor camps. This harsh policy destroyed the most hardworking and productive farmers in the villages. The effects of this decision hurt the entire economy for a long time. Despite that, industrialization gave the country a powerful boost. By 1940, industrial production had grown 9 times compared to 1913, and national income had grown 6 times. This leap is exactly what helped the Soviet Union survive the Great Patriotic War. However, after the victory in 1945, the pace of heavy industry development didn't slow down. A powerful new rival appeared on the horizon, and the arms race began. Priority was still given to machines, equipment, and military technology, often at the expense of light industry, clothing, food, furniture, and everyday consumer goods. After the devastating war, there still wasn't enough money for everything. The state bought grain and other products from collective farms at very low fixed prices. Under the planned system, peasants had to sell their harvest at whatever rate the government set. As a result, people in the countryside barely earned anything. The motivation to work hard disappeared, and many families lived in real poverty. Young people left the villages in huge numbers and moved to the cities. After the war, there were massive construction projects there that paid noticeably better. The numbers show it clearly. By 1961, the urban and rural populations were equal, even though in 1939 about 67% of Soviet citizens still lived in villages. Meanwhile, new residential neighborhoods were quickly going up in the cities. Houses were built using new technology in just a matter of weeks. Large prefabricated sections allowed construction at speeds never seen before. But over time it became obvious, the resources that had been squeezed out of the countryside in the 1930s through the 1950s to build heavy industry were not being used in the smartest way. Starting in 1961, the Soviet Union began buying 10 to 20 times more machines and equipment from capitalist countries than it sold to them. And the problem wasn't that the economy was so powerful it couldn't keep up with its own needs. On the contrary, the standard of living stayed modest, around the level of Mexico or Chile, while the United States, Germany, and France produced many times more goods and services. Nikolai Ryzhkov, who headed the Council of Ministers in the late 1980s, later wrote it plainly: Soviet industrial products were almost uncompetitive on the world market. Capitalist countries bought only about 6% of our machine-building exports. The rest mostly went to other socialist countries. What was the main reason? It was the very nature of the planned economy, which left almost no room for private initiative. All the key decisions, what to produce and in what quantities, came from the top, from the State Planning Committee, Gosplan. A conversation from the late 1980s illustrates this perfectly. Gorbachev's aide Georgy Shikhnazarov asked Marshal Sergei Akhromeyev, chief of the General Staff, why the country needed so many weapons. The marshal replied roughly like this: "We built first-class factories at the cost of enormous sacrifice, no worse than the Americans. Are you suggesting we shut them down and switch to making pots and pans?" It was hard to argue with that kind of logic. On top of that, most ideas from Soviet inventors and innovators got buried in bureaucratic red tape and the indifference of factory managers. By the 1960s, the country had become heavily dependent on imported technology. And this raises the big question: how did they pay for it all? Before the war, equipment, machines, and licenses were largely paid for by exporting food. But from the 1970s onward, the situation completely flipped. A country that had once been one of the world's biggest grain exporters now started buying large amounts of grain itself. The leadership found itself trapped in a vicious circle created by its own decisions. To increase food production, they needed to modernize agriculture. But there were fewer and fewer workers left in the villages. Modernization required advanced technology from the West. To buy it, they needed something to sell. They used to sell grain, but now they didn't even have enough for their own country. That's why, in the early 1950s, Nikita Khrushchev launched the huge Virgin Lands program. The plan was to turn the untouched steppes of Siberia and Kazakhstan into vast new farmland and solve the food problem through expansion. However, the climate in those regions was too harsh and unpredictable. The plowed land quickly lost fertility, and dust storms began. The program turned out to be inefficient and was basically shut down by 1962. That same year, in an attempt to fix things, the government raised the prices it paid to collective farms. This triggered inflation and a drop in people's real income. Protests broke out across the country. The most serious events happened in Novichokhovsk. Workers went on strike, and the authorities brutally suppressed it using police, the army, and the KGB. Organizers were either shot or sent to labor camps. Realizing how serious the situation was, in 1963 the state spent 1/3 of its gold reserves to buy imported grain and other food. A country that had fed half of Europe at the beginning of the 20th century had become a major food importer. It became clear, if nothing changed, the crisis could engulf the entire Union. So where did the Soviet Union get the hard currency for technology and food in the 1970s? Two lucky things happened at once that temporarily delayed the inevitable. First, in the 1960s they discovered giant oil and gas fields in western Siberia. Second, in the 1970s world energy prices shot up because of crises in the Middle East. The Soviet Union took full advantage. It sharply increased production and began selling large amounts of oil and gas for foreign currency, which gave the budget a big boost. The government fell into a dangerously simple way of thinking. Why struggle with the complicated problems in the countryside when you can make money much more easily by selling raw materials? There was enough income to buy food and to support allied regimes around the world, from Africa to Asia. By 1980, the food, along with machines and equipment, had become a major part of imports, while oil and gas became the country's main export. Huge amounts of money were poured into the oil industry. Yesterday's small towns in western Siberia, Nizhnevartovsk, Surgut, Khanty-Mansiysk, turned into major industrial centers. But the fundamental problems didn't go away. In the mid-1980s, the world oil market became oversupplied, and prices dropped by nearly 2/3. At the same time, the big, relatively cheap oil fields were gradually running out. The ability to buy advanced technology shrank sharply. There was almost nothing to offer the West except raw materials that were getting cheaper and cheaper. Foreign trade slowed down, which meant the country could buy less food. Even in this tough situation, there was still a chance to find a way out. But the new decisions made by the leadership only made things worse. In 1979, the Soviet Union sent troops into Afghanistan. The 10-year war cost around 30 billion rubles and became a heavy financial burden. Then in 1985, the anti-alcohol campaign began. It caused a sharp drop in budget revenue, about 10%, because alcohol sales fell dramatically. Alcohol was banned in workplaces, removed from trains, planes, cafeterias, and hotels. Breaking the rules meant immediate firing. As a result, the country's budget went into permanent deficit from that point on. Every year the government was short tens of billions of rubles to fix the growing problems. To plug the holes, the state bank started printing money on a massive scale. This only fueled inflation, and with fixed prices in place, it led to total shortages of goods. Formally, savings accounts in Sberbank were growing, but in reality they were just pieces of paper. There was almost nothing to buy. Sugar, soap, laundry detergent, and even basic food disappeared from store shelves. People bought up everything they could just to protect whatever value their money still had. By the end of the decade, only about 11% of everyday consumer goods were freely available. Waves of strikes swept the country because people couldn't get even the most basic necessities. Faith that the planned economy could deliver stability and prosperity finally melted away. Letting prices float freely would have meant admitting the complete failure of the system under Soviet ideology. Still, in 1986 the leadership tried some partial reforms. First they allowed individual labor activity, then passed the law on cooperatives, which legalized private business. But these steps only made the situation worse. Cooperatives bought goods from state enterprises at low fixed prices and resold them at market prices. Thousands of new banks sprang up to serve this sector. With weak oversight, they turned into machines for cashing out and moving money out of the country. The economic crisis became so deep that the country could no longer properly service its foreign debts. Ships loaded with food for the USSR sat in ports in Brazil, New Zealand, and Norway. They wouldn't leave because payments were overdue by billions. In 1990, Finance Minister Valentin Pavlov noted in his report that the external debt had reached a level where it was growing on its own, even without new borrowing, just from the interest. That same year, nearly all the revenue from oil and gas exports had to go towards servicing the foreign debt. By then, foreign commercial banks had stopped giving new loans, the risk was too high. The only option left was to turn directly to Western governments. It's worth immediately dispelling the popular conspiracy theory that the West deliberately destroyed the USSR. In reality, the collapse of the Union came as a complete surprise to Western politicians, just as it did to Soviet leaders. As late as 1982, a CIA report to the U.S. Congress stated that, despite slower growth and gaps between plans and reality, an economic collapse of the USSR in the near future was not considered a realistic possibility. Earlier, negotiations with the West had been on equal terms. But by the late 1980s, everything had changed. Loans were now given only on the condition that Moscow would stop using force to keep its influence in Eastern Europe. By 1990, the budget deficit had reached 58 billion rubles. Not only foreign payments, but also domestic ones, salaries, pensions, and army maintenance, were at risk. The signal that the central government would no longer use force to maintain control was understood immediately. In the republics, the Baltics, the Caucasus, Ukraine, and others, national movements grew sharply stronger. The policy of glasnost and democratization, which was supposed to renew the system, instead triggered a wave of long-suppressed ethnic conflicts across the Union. By 1990, most republics had declared sovereignty, the famous Parade of Sovereignties had begun. Moscow no longer had the resources or the authority to hold the country together. In the fall of 1991, the republics set up customs borders with Russia, and tax revenues to the center dropped sharply. Vneshekonombank, the Soviet foreign trade bank, essentially went bankrupt. The state couldn't even fund its own embassies abroad. It finally became clear, keeping the Soviet Union in its old form was impossible. There was no working economy left, no shared ideology, and no real territorial integrity. The one main task left was to prevent a large-scale civil war on a huge territory filled with enormous amounts of weapons and military sites. This is probably a big reason why the collapse was relatively peaceful, especially compared to the tragedy in Yugoslavia. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev announced his resignation. The next day, the history of the USSR officially ended. I am leaving my post with concern, but also with hope. With faith in you, in your wisdom and strength of spirit, he said in his final address. That was the end of a huge superpower. The model of forced industrialization and a rigid planned economy chosen in the late 1920s could not withstand its accumulated internal contradictions and finally collapsed. And then came the wild 1990s, the time of free prices, privatization, and a massive redistribution of property.